What if I told you that Disney once remade a Mickey Mouse cartoon almost frame for frame 7 years after the original? Same story, same gags, even the same animation drawings, just updated in full color with updated designs. But why would they do that? And why was this the only one? The answer says a lot about Disney's ambitions and the changing landscape of animation in the 1940s. Let's take a look at Orphan's Benefit and its one-of-a-kind remake. In the early 1930s, Mickey Mouse was becoming a household name, and Orphan's Benefit, released in 1934, was one of his more popular cartoons. But what made this short truly memorable wasn't just Mickey, it was also the debut of the feisty new character named Donald Duck.
Introducing Donald Duck.
Donald's explosive temper and refusal to be laughed at made him an instant hit, and a perfect foil for Mickey's increasingly wholesome persona.
Attaboy.
Fast forward to 1941, Disney was now producing cartoons exclusively in Technicolor, and Disney's earliest black and white shorts, no matter how beloved, were considered outdated by theater distributors. But these early films still had value if they could be updated. Disney had already tested this idea. Back in 1932, the studio produced the Parade of Award Nominees, a color short created exclusively for the 5th Academy Awards banquet. It featured Mickey and friends alongside caricatures of that year's top movie stars. In 1939, Disney reused that same footage in a commercial film called The Standard Parade, this time with updated character designs traced over the original animation. So the concept of reusing animation wasn't new, but until Orphan's Benefit, it hadn't been tried on a short meant for wide theatrical release. The plan was simple. Take several popular black and white Mickey Mouse cartoons, trace the animation, modernize the character models, and repaint them in full Technicolor. But the Orphan's Benefit ended up being the only one completed. When you line up the original and the remake of Orphan's Benefit, it's remarkable just to see how closely they match, shot for shot and pose for the most part. But look closer and you'll start to see a few subtle differences that reveal how much the Disney team had grown in the 7 years between versions. They had started to understand some of the principles of animation, 12 in fact, that include things like squash and stretch, arcs, staging, anticipation, and appeal. And they were integrating those into their animation. And you can see, as you put these side by side, where some of the differences are. For example, in this part where Mickey Mouse introduces Clara Cluck, in the original, his actions are a lot more linear and pointed.
Introducing the Barnyard Nightingale, Madam Clara Cluck.
But in the remake, there's a lot more arcs in his movements, and he even does a little extra flourish with his hand as he's introducing her onto the stage.
Madam Clara Cluck.
The animation timing is noticeably tighter in the 1941 version. Movements feel snappier and more polished. The characters have more weight and fluidity, proof of how far the animators had come in mastering their craft. But there are also small, fascinating content updates. In the original 1934 version, Donald Duck yells, "Aw, nuts," in frustration. A phrase typical of his early appearances, but by 1941, however, Donald had become famous for a new catchphrase, "Aw, phooey." It's a subtle update, but it remarks Donald's growing identity. It's interesting that the animation of his mouth didn't change, even though the words do. Another revision comes when Donald says, "I'm mortified." In the original, his beak briefly morphs into a long, dangling Jimmy Durante-style nose. A classic bit of 1930s cartoon exaggeration and caricature. But that gag was removed in the remake, likely because it felt dated by the early 1940s. Even Mickey gets a slight emotional upgrade. In the 1934 version, when Donald bumps into him at the start of the show, Mickey just smiles and carries on, but in the remake, he frowns. An added reaction that gives the moment a bit more character, interplay, and emotional nuance. These differences don't change the fact that the film is essentially a frame-for-frame recreation, but they do show how Disney's animation style and storytelling sensibilities had matured. So why did Disney choose Orphan's Benefit of all the early Mickey Mouse shorts for this ambitious remake and experiment? For starters, the short held a special place in the studio's history. When it premiered in 1934, Orphan's Benefit marked the first time Donald Duck appeared in a Mickey Mouse cartoon. He'd made his debut earlier that year in The Wise Little Hen, but it was here, in a supporting role, performing for a crowd of orphans, that he truly began to shine. Audiences were immediately taken with Donald's fiery personality. He was loud, quick-tempered, and completely unpredictable, a sharp contrast to Mickey, who had become pretty safe as a character, and by 1934 had mellowed into a more polite and safe leading man. In fact, some at the studio had begun to feel that Mickey had grown a bit stale. As his fame skyrocketed, his rougher edges were smoothed away, and that rebellious spark that had defined his earliest appearances began to fade. Donald, on the other hand, was all edge. He brought back the kind of chaotic energy Mickey used to have, and audiences loved him for it. Orphan's Benefit wasn't just the beginning of Donald's rise, it was the start of a shift in the studio's character hierarchy. Within just a few years, Donald would become one of Disney's most bankable stars, often headlining shorts of his own. So when the time came to test the idea of color remakes, Orphan's Benefit made perfect sense. It was a beloved short featuring both the studio's biggest stars at a key moment in their development. Plus, it gave the animators a chance to revisit some standout performances, particularly Donald's famous stage meltdown, and show off how much more expressive and refined their work had become. The remake of Orphan's Benefit was meant to be just the beginning. Disney had hoped to breathe new life into several of its other earlier black and white cartoons by updating them in color with refreshed character designs so that they could get additional distribution for those refreshed shorts. But despite the promise of this approach, Orphan's Benefit ended up being the only remake ever released. But why? First, the practical side. While colorized reissues could earn extra money for the studio, remaking an entire short, frame by frame, was labor-intensive. Artists had to dig out the original animation drawings, trace them with updated model sheets, and re-ink and paint everything, all while preserving the timing, acting, and spirit of the original, because they were doing everything along with the original soundtrack. Second, there were doubts about how profitable this approach would be in the long run. While audiences appreciated Technicolor, they were also hungry for new material. And third, probably the most important, was the world was about to change. By the early 1940s, the United States had entered World War II. The Disney studio quickly shifted gears, taking on government contracts to produce training films, propaganda shorts, and morale boosters for the war effort. With the studio's manpower redirected and resources stretched thin, the idea of continuing a labor-intensive remake initiative fell to the wayside. But whatever the reason, Orphan's Benefit remains a fascinating anomaly.
Attaboy.
A one-of-a-kind experiment that captured a moment when the studio looked back and just as quickly moved forward. If you enjoyed this exploration of Orphan's Benefit and how Disney remade one of their classics, why not check out my playlist of deep dives where I explore more in the classic Disney animation history. And I'll see you over there.